Welcome to PVA Blood. We're gonna build an ancient, evil Necron monolith that has been corrupted by a different kind of evil, the powers of chaos. It's also gonna have an active warp portal. Cool. As I usually do, I begin with some EVA foam and some inspiration, the Convergence of Dominion model. I've also got an old smartphone, which I pulled out of a drawer. A lot of people just hang on to these, you spend a lot of money, you're sort of reluctant to get rid of it. We're going to use that today. So with the EVA foam, slice off the teeth, get yourself a nice tidy piece of foam here, and we're going to be cutting out sort of like a coffin shape, which is what the Convergence of Dominion is. A lot of Necron terrain is, in fact. It's got the same number of sides as a coffin, but I'm going to use the length of the phone as the measurement. So 3 times the height and 1 times the width. The exact dimensions and measurements don't really matter, as long as you get the shape right. The key thing for me was to make sure that the terrain piece was large enough that I could have the whole screen of a smartphone showing and still have enough space for the building to be structurally sound. So you can see here I'm just sort of measuring out spaces to make sure that the smartphone would fit there, and also that it was going to be tall enough to still clearly look like a Necron terrain piece. Now I'm marking on the textured side of the foam because the other side, the flat textureless side, is actually going to be the outside surface of the terrain piece, so all the markings won't show up when the building is complete. I'm using like a 90-degree set square thing just to help with the angles, but you can use like anything with a 90-degree angle on it to help make these lines perfectly spot on. You can see here that I've got all of the lines marked out on the textured side, and here's a rough guide of the measurements. About 3 times the phone height tall and 1 times the phone height wide. Plenty of space for the phone screen to stick through, and there's also a vertical line running all the way along the length of these, because at a later step we are going to be cutting them in half, because the Convergence of Dominion models also have a vertical slice through the center. Tracing out the second half, just going to use the metal skewer like I did when I carved the first part, and that'll leave me with 2 identical pieces. One will serve as the front and one will serve as the back. Really simple stuff, not a lot of precision needed, just take your time. Easy. I'm just tracing some straight lines from the fattest corners on these pieces, and then I'm just going to cut a groove along those lines. So I'm going to come in with a blade at about 45-degree angles either side, or in this case I'm using a saw, just to cut out like a very shallow trench. I'm not cutting all the way through, I'm just cutting out this little trench, so then I will be able to bend the foam with the bend actually occurring in that gap without actually the large panels bending themselves, keeping them to be flat faces. You're going to have to forgive me, I'm probably going to call this thing a pylon or a monolith just to force a habit, but it's just Necron terrain, you know what I mean. So I've got some spare insulation foam left over from a previous project, but you can use EVA if you prefer. And now these are just used to ensure the monolith has a stable core, so the thickness, but also that there is space enough for the phone to fit inside the actual terrain piece. It's held in place using toothpicks and PVA glue, and then I'm going to be testing the bends. Yep, flat edges. And also making sure that I leave a gap so the phone case will be able to fit inside when it's all finished. So I'm just double and triple checking that everything is going to fit correctly, making sure that when I slice these pieces up the middle, that I will still be able to not only reattach them all back together again, but there will still, of course, be enough space for the phone case to fit inside. So I'm just, as soon as I've made a successful cut, I'm just tracing it on the other side, just to make sure that everything is going to pair up and match nicely. So I'm deliberately leaving a gap between the left and the right hand facing sides, so that there is a vertical slice missing through the center, matching the convergence of Dominion design. You can see here, I'm just tracing out roughly what I think the screen size is going to be, because I'm going to be cutting these out to act as the open active warp portal on the finished terrain piece. I'm not worrying about being too precise, because you'll see in later steps, any mistakes that you make now can be easily fixed or hidden, so don't worry about it, just keep building. Checking the fit, putting a piece of foam behind just to see if I can use that piece of foam to keep that size stable. Yeah, looking good. There's not actually a lot new that I'm doing during these stages. I'm just adding some phone pieces on the interior to make sure that the cavity which the phone case is going to sit is going to line up properly with the hole when you slide it in, and that everything is going to sit snug so that when the phone case is actually inside the terrain piece, it's going to sit flush with the opening. So I'm just adding pieces in here to make sure the space and the fit is snug. I've got an excess piece of foam from another project. I'm going to be sticking into one of these halves, and that is going to be the backing piece that the phone is going to sit against. It's also going to keep the two halves from actually touching each other and leaving a gap. So I'm just going to glue one side in for now and not glue in the other whilst I'm working on the edges. You can see I'm checking the fit, looking good. So I used toothpicks and some PVA glue to pin the top together, and I did the same on the bottom, but just left a gap so a phone could still fit through. And then I traced the side panels along a piece of foam core. Now you can get this from art supply stores, you can get it from craft shops, dollar stores, you name it, it's cheap, it's everywhere, it's easy to use. Just get yourself a couple of panels, trace it, cut it, use some PVA glue, use some toothpicks to pin it in place, simple stuff. So each side I've just used 3 different segments, which I've just traced and then cut. You'll see here that I repeat the process for each of these panels. Straightforward, just do as I did. When it's all dry, cut it flush with some clippers so you don't have toothpicks sticking out. Just trace it out, cut it out, glue it in, hold it in place with a toothpick. Cannot be any simpler. Now you can see there's a lot of imperfections here. You can see there's some gaps where I've cut it out, some places where there's maybe sort of like damage to the foam. Doesn't matter. You're going to be hiding all of this later on. Now the corners where they are actually meeting these foam core pieces, you're going to actually end up having to cut them to actually have bigger gaps, because the convergence of Dominion models actually have gaps on those corners anyway. So hope you didn't spend a lot of effort trying to make that precise, because it doesn't matter. You're going to want to undo your work later on. What I'm getting at is just enjoy the build. Don't worry about being too precise. You can see here a lot of imperfections, some dents, some areas where the lines aren't perfectly straight. Doesn't matter. You'll be hiding it, you'll be fixing it later on. Now on the inside you can see I haven't glued it together yet, but you can sort of see the arrangement I've got for fitting the phone inside. So the phone will just slide in and sit in this cavity. Easy. So the convergence of Dominion models are bisected, trisected, whatever. They've got these lines running across the face that meet in the center. So you can see here that I'm tracing them out, and then I'm going to be cutting them in using a blade later on, and then cutting on either side of the initial cut to create grooves, which will be the main cosmetic details on the front there. I repeat the process on the back and also on the sides. Easy stuff. Coming in with a saw, taking my time. So on the back I used this jar just to cut out like a circle shape, or trace a circle shape, and then cut it out later on with a Stanley knife, just to create a divot. So coming in 45-degree angles like I did earlier, and peeling out that little section. Now you don't want to go all the way through, you want to keep these shallow, as these are cosmetic, not structural. Careful not to cut yourself. And you can sort of see the benefit of not sticking those two halves together just yet. Keeping them separate made this a lot easier. And there you are. It's looking pretty Necron. Now there's no prize for guessing that this was coming. I'm going to be using some gap filler over pretty much the entirety of the exposed areas. So all these face panels, I'm just coming along and applying the gap filler. This is not only going to hide any dents or damage or gaps, but it's also going to help create the texture that I want, which is going to be like a stone effect. I didn't worry about the grooves, I focused mainly on the faces, and of course I didn't put any on the inside. Keeping it just regular soft foam will be better for any phones that are placed inside. Yeah, easy stuff. Now, obviously, try to make it smooth. If you can't, come in later on with some sandpaper. I just stapled a piece of sandpaper to a wooden block, and I'm just coming in and sanding it. I'm not going nuts, I'm just getting rid of the worst of the mistakes. A bit of texture and roughness will work in your favor ultimately. Whilst you're waiting for the gap filler to dry, we're going to mix some grey paint with some PVA glue and a bit of water, and this is going to be a base coat. Now, the reason we're adding this is to help protect that gap filler. It can be slightly brittle, so this will stop it from cracking under heat or if it gets knocked over during a game, and it's also going to protect it from melting if you're using any spray paints later on. Once that's dry, you can see that it is rock solid. I will be adding some battle damage by chipping it later on, but the rest of it will be protected. Now I'm going to be sticking both halves together, but along this vertical section, I'm actually going to have a whole bunch of toothpicks glued into place. Now you'll notice that I'm not putting these down in an even manner. In fact, they're really uneven and strange angles. There's a deliberate reason for this. So what I'm going to end up doing later on is I'm going to be putting a lot of hot glue in there to be gore and flesh. So those uneven toothpicks are going to be like the skeletal framework, which is going to keep that glue from falling all the way down. And there you are. You can really see how this piece is going to look when it's done now. Got an undercoat. It's starting to come together. And the phone still fits.
Order, unity, obedience. We told galaxies these long ago. Clearly must do so again.
You might recognize this chunk of wood I've been using as a paint palette for a while, but I'm going to get the saw out. I'm going to soften some of these edges so they're a little bit more angled, and it will become the base for the monolith. Yeah, nice. This is an optional step, definitely not necessary, but if you want to create a bit more of a sense of grandeur and significance to this terrain piece, as well as, you know, height, make a plinth. So this plinth is just a square piece of foam. I then went and measured 2 inches from each of these corners, and I'm going to draw a straight line between each of those points, and then chop them off, and it will create an octagonal shape for me, which I will glue to that wooden piece from the previous step. Don't lose a finger. Now, of course, the phone has to pass through the plinth as well, so I just put the terrain piece on top of the plinth and traced out a suitable sized hole from the inside there, and then I just cut all the way through using a knife. Don't have to be too precise here, as long as it's large enough for the phone to pass through, you're good. Nice. Now that the obelisk itself is going to be raised off the ground, it means that the phone will fall out if I just put it in there, or it's not going to line up properly because of the plinth. So to offset this height difference, I'm just creating a little plug using some of those foam teeth pieces so that the phone will be held in the right position. Very good. I will also be cutting a hole in that plug, so if I want a charge cable to go through, it can without any issue. Simple. The phone won't be able to get through the timber unless you cut a hole, so I just used the drill to cut a series of holes and then tidied up that space using a knife. Adding some more detail to the plinth, I used a knife to whittle out some steps, and I stuck some toothpicks and PVA glue on the top, and I'm going to glue the monolith into place. Now if the toothpicks pass through, don't worry, you can just trim them as needed with a clipper, as you can see I did here. And then make sure you give it plenty of time to dry before moving on to the next step. Cool. Necron architecture is generally pretty Spartan with their decoration, but they do have a sense of style. So I'm just going to cut some simple grooves into the ground here. Same angular cutting method as I've used previously, just to give that surface some detail. I grabbed some lengths of chain from the hardware store. The 41st Millennium loves their chains, and so these are going to be anchored to the base and to the obelisk, conveying the idea that the Chaos Forces have truly enslaved this ancient technology. So I've got this corrugated tubing, which a lot of places call cable protectors, split tubing. It's great for general terrain purposes, but it's going to be a nice, easy visual shorthand to convey the idea that dark science has been used to accelerate this infestation and corruption of ancient technology. Yeah, get it from a hardware store. It's really light. It's easy to cut. You can cut it with scissors or just a regular blade, and then just use some hot glue to glue it in. So maybe it's pumping in some sort of corruption or siphoning out the excess. It's dark science. Just go mad. Once I'd cut the chains to a length that I felt appropriate, I anchored them in place by sticking in a toothpick, looping over the chain, and then hot gluing it in place. Don't worry about using too much hot glue because we're going to be applying a whole lot more later on. It'll just add to the effect. This would be a good point to add some battle damage if you wanted to, cut out some chunks or anything like that, which is what I did. And what you're left with should be something very close to the final finished product, just with a couple of key steps to go. I didn't think of this until later on in the project, but I cut a channel for the charging cable to fit through as well, so the terrain piece can sit flat and have power reach the phone if it's needed. This is probably more useful for older devices, Apple phones, because the batteries are often not so flash anymore. Get some grease paper, baking paper, parchment paper, whatever, wrap it over the phone case you had earlier and stick it inside the terrain piece. Get out a hot glue gun and start going nuts. So you can see I'm applying it around the edges here. This is where the warp portal is. This is where all the meat from another dimension is piling out. Just go wild. I've got a metal skewer here that I'm using to mess around the glue, make it messy, stringy, and just spreading like a corruption. It's like a cancer in our reality. So just go wild. You can see I'm putting it here on those toothpicks that I stuck in earlier. There was a reason I did that. And on the anchor points as well. Have some fun. You can see this takes no skill. There's nothing fancy. I'm just having a laugh with some hot glue. The only thing you have to really be concerned about is not burning yourself, so just take a bit of care as you're doing this, but pretty much go hog wild. Now on the back here, I realized that I wanted something slightly different to the front, obviously. So I thought, hey, you know those chunks of insulation foam that I cut off the corners earlier? Let's break them up and jam them into that space. Cool, now they're jammed in there. Let's start applying some hot glue over the top, put some more chunks in. This is just like big, demonic chunks of meat seeping out the back. It's gonna look gnarly. Then, prime it grey. The insulation foam doesn't melt as readily as other forms of foam, but still hit it from a distance. When that's done, I got out some of this grey tile grout, and I mixed that tile grout with some grey paint and PVA glue, like I did earlier, and a little bit of water if needed, but mostly just paint and glue. And I'm just going to be painting small amounts of this grit mix on the terrain piece where I thought it needed some more texture, because this is really going to help sell that sand effect, and I think this is going to look like sandstone in the end, so that's what I did. Just sort of randomly. Obviously I applied a lot more on the ground where I thought there'd be more dirt and dust build-up, and on the plinth, but I did on some of these large sort of face panels just put a bit of this grit down just to help sell the sandstone effect later on. You can see that once you prime this, it looks a lot more like a cohesive whole. You should find that any doubts you had in your work will sort of disappear when you can see it as like a single piece. It's looking pretty gnarly. Yeah, cool. And then give that plenty of time to dry. Once that's all dried up, time for your primary color. So you can use Xandri dust, but if you're in Australia, it's weirdly expensive and hard to find. So I'm just going to use like this sort of khaki mustard color. Oh, it's straight up called mustard. Yeah, anything like this, off yellow, greeny yellow, it'll do the job. Just spray paint everything. Easy. And then patchily hit it with an off-white. If you don't have any off-white available, you can use regular white, just apply it from a good distance. You're not trying to cover that mustard color, you just want to make it patchy. See? Mostly mustard still. So this is not that same grey paint from a moment ago that had the grouts in it. This is the grey paint from before that point, where it's just paint and glue. I'm putting it onto the chains and I'm putting it onto the pipes. I'm using a smaller brush, but you can clearly see it's a cheap, old, nasty one, and I'm just one color over all of these areas. If you make mistakes, don't worry, we'll be hiding them later on. When you're done, give it all time to dry, because now it's time to use a brown wash. So when it comes to washes, you can just add a whole lot of water to some brown paint, which is what I normally do. But for this build, I made a mix of brown ink with some acrylic medium and a dash of PVA glue, and of course, plenty of water. Now this is pretty much the same recipe you would use if you were going to be making, say, your own blood recipe, which I have a video about, but you just add some PVA glue to it and add about twice the amount of water. I'm just going to hit everything. The entirety of this piece, I'm just going to hit with the same wash in about the same amount. Big brush, just go mad. It really is this simple, just a big brush over everything. You don't really have to worry about it pooling, it's just going to add to the effect later on. But that said, if you think there's too much, you can use a tissue to wipe off some excess. In this build, I just let it dry where it was. But you want it dry for the next step. Take a moment to appreciate your handiwork. You've made some sort of monument to the god of grilled cheese. Neat. Now you can try to reclaim your phone case. Now if you pull on the baking paper, it's probably not going to come out straight away. So what you'll want to do is to get a tool of some sort, or even just your finger, and gently start to pry the super glue from the paper. Don't stab it, don't jab it, don't tear the paper. Just use your finger and just work it until it will come loose. This is definitely worth taking your time on because it will really sell the effects on the final piece. You can see here, I'm just prying it loose, and then it will just pull out nice and easily. Pretty cool. Once that's done, you can start to dry brush. To do so, you're going to want a white and an off-white creamy color to dry brush with. The order is going to be cream paint over the entirety of the terrain piece, except for the pipes and the chain. Don't mind my coffee, it's hot, it's 36 Celsius, I've got coffee and ice. Anyway, cream on the main terrain piece using a big brush. Dry brushing all of that. Then you get the white paint. We're going to be dry brushing the chains and the pipe and the raised areas on the terrain piece. So when you dry brush, put some paint on a brush, wipe most of it off. See, there's almost no paint left on the brush here, and then I'm just going to be dusting that over all of those cheesy yellow stone surfaces. Dust, 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 dry brush, dry brush, dry brush. Really easy, it's just going to make all those details pop. And it's going to look slightly less like cheese. You can stop here if you want, but I feel once you've done the cream, you may as well do the white paint. It doesn't take much more time, and it just helps those extra details pop. So you want to really focus on those edges and on the grey areas. Try to have a little bit of a think about where's the areas most likely to get a lot more light catching them, and that's pretty much where we're going to be applying most of this white. Just dry brushing it on, just adding some extra attention where we think it's needed. Dry brushing, dry brushing, dry brushing. Looking cool. Now we're going to be painting all of that melty cheesy glue. So I've made some purple paint using some red and blue mixed together, and I'm going to be adding some brown paint in some splotches in random places. Now I'm thinking that this flesh is really tortured, it's not from our reality, so honestly you don't have to use reds or skin tones. You can use any color. Like, there's no reason this can't be green, you know. Maybe it's Nurgle infested, maybe it's alien flesh, you know. Make it blue, make it purple like I have. You know, this is not necessarily like stuff that has come from a human being or any animal we understand. This could be the stone itself turning into a living being. This is warp stuff, so as long as it's uncomfortable and wet looking, it's gonna look cool. Don't worry about being precise. Have fun. I did try to pick out the larger tendrils of glue. I did try to take my time and take a bit of care, but if I made a mistake or if some of that paint dripped onto it, I wasn't worried. I'm going to be fixing this in the final step. The step that I've been telling you about, where we're going to fix all the mistakes, that's coming up right next, okay? So just enjoy this. It's looking messed up. Time for the final step. All your mistakes, all your regrets can be hidden and washed away with the purifying nature of blood. This is my blood recipe. I have a dedicated video showing you how to make your own. It's only 3 minutes long. It's super easy and effective. So this may look purple now, but it is going to dry like a rich, gory red color. And I'm just applying this over all of that purple, and I'm going out and picking areas I made mistakes. I'm just hiding them under blood. That's right, mistakes can be hidden with blood. Excellent stuff. There should be a link for that video, by the way. I wanted this to look like an 8-pointed star, and to do so I just added some arrowheads on the top there. And that's done. Let's fire it up. Phone goes in, followed by the plug. You can see the hole that I poked through it, so a charge cable could fit through, and fit through the hole there, if you wished. So if you play a 4-hour game like I usually end up having to do, the phone won't go flat. Yeah, play whatever video you want, and enjoy the trippy effects. I think it looks cool. Just cool. Of course I didn't forget the Pocket Marine. Here he is. He's going to sit right here. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please subscribe, like it, tell a friend, the usual jazz. Big thanks to UUW again for his music, and his work is linked below. And of course you can find me and some sneak peeks at upcoming projects and some of my other odds and ends on my Instagram, which is @PVAboy, hopefully linked below. Now if you've got ideas for future videos, any questions, constructive criticism, don't hesitate to hit me up, even if it's on one of my older videos. I'll do what I can to get back to you. But yeah, I'd love to know what you think. Should I be making more pieces in this style? Should I make some more Necron themed terrain? Or do you hate it? Would you like me to go back to more conventional barricades and cityscapes? You know, I will get onto that in the future, but if you'd like, you know, what would you like to see next? Dang, this is a big piece. This is what happens when you're sick of your big units getting shot to bits every time you play games. So you start building cover large enough that you can hide knights behind it. Yeah, I want to keep making videos to help you make the gaming table that you and your mates have always wanted. Hopefully these weird angles aren't making you sick. I'm just really trying to show off how effective these super simple methods are at getting across this just horrible, nightmarish, gore-soaked abomination to our reality. Now this is hot glue, bit of paint, and like some bootleg blood effects. Looks gnarly. At least I think so. Seriously, I leave this thing plugged in and visiting guests just have to deal with a portal to the warp. But yeah, thanks for stopping by. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.